Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Gilles Mongeau was born in Montreal and raised in Ottawa. He has been a Jesuit for 37 years and a priest for 25 of those years. After studies in philosophy at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, and at the University of Ottawa, he obtained the Master of Arts degree in medieval philosophy, as well as the license in philosophy. He taught philosophy at Campion College in Regina, which is in the province of Saskatchewan in Western Canada, for 2 years. After further studies in Toronto, Fribourg in Switzerland, and Boston, he obtained the doctorate in theology from Regis College and the University of Toronto, as well as the Doctor of Sacred Theology degree from Regis College. From 2003 to 2018, he taught systematic and pastoral theology at Regis College and Centre Sèvres, the Jesuit faculty of theology in Paris. His areas of expertise are the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, the spiritual theology of St. Ignatius Loyola, and the thought of Bernard Lonergan. In addition to his intellectual ministry, Father Gilles has worked in parish ministry, university chaplaincy, hospital chaplaincy, ministry to LGBTQ Catholics, and in various retreat and spiritual direction ministries. He has developed pedagogies of human and spiritual formation for ministry candidates, and until 2018 was superior of the Jesuit community at Cardinere House, which is a first studies community in Toronto. He is presently the assistant to the Provincial and the Director of Formation for the Jesuits of Canada. That's all the kind of serious stuff. But he's also a valued member of my community in Montreal, where he generously shares his multiform talents, which include baking bread, making jams and marmalades and chutney, and burdening us with his puns. Ladies and gentlemen, the Reverend Dr. Gilles Mongeau.
I promise there's no puns tonight. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening, to speak on seeing all things new in Christ, but especially to speak on the first of the Universal Apostolic Preferences. And without further ado, Father General has done a lot of my work for me, so let's get started. We're not getting there we go. So, seeing the variety in the room, I realized that people will have had different experiences of receiving the Universal Apostolic Preferences in their settings, in their school settings, and I'm going to take just a moment to go through with you how we got the Universal Apostolic Preferences in the first place, because I think that probably a number of people won't have heard of the process that led to the articulation and the promulgation of the Universal Apostolic Preferences. So where did they come from? The 36th General Congregation of the Society of Jesus, which elected Father General Sosa, also asked him, as part of the tasks they assigned to him to carry on the work of the General Congregation, asked him to evaluate progress on the existing, at that time, existing apostolic priorities of the Society of Jesus, to evaluate them, and then, if appropriate, to update them, to identify new preferences. The previous priorities, just so you know, and I'm playing with two words here, priorities and preferences, and the difference is very important, as we're going to see. The previous priorities of the Society of Jesus were our presence in Africa and China, our responsibility for the Roman works entrusted to us by the popes, the consistency of our intellectual apostolate around the world, and the Jesuit Refugee Service. So you see, what you have here is very specific works or types of apostolates named. And then the General Congregation went on to say that discernment of any new priorities or preferences should include the greatest possible participation of the society and of those involved with us in the mission. And this was new. So the previous priorities had been identified by the Superior General of the Society, Father Kolvenbach, really from his perspective of knowing the entire Society of Jesus. What the 36th General Congregation was asking Father General to do was to begin not from above, but from below upwards. And so to have the greatest possible consultation on the ground and to let that consultation move up to the General and his council, so that there would really be a sense of having listened to the entire Society of Jesus and the entire apostolic body associated with the mission of the Society of Jesus. In order to do that, Father General had to help educate the society, because the kind of spiritual discernment that was called for by the General Congregation had not been done in recent decades in the Society of Jesus. So even the Jesuits wouldn't necessarily know how to go about this kind of discernment, communal discernment process from below upwards. And so in July 2017, Father General issued a letter called Our Life is Mission, Mission is Our Life, in which he issued a call to personal, communal, and institutional conversion as a necessary foundation for the work that was to be done. Really, it was a call to spiritual depth through spiritual conversation and communal discernment. Two phrases, spiritual discernment, spiritual conversation and communal discernment, that weren't necessarily well known in the society or in the society's works. And so in September 2017, Father General issued a second letter precisely on discernment in common, giving a sense of how one might go about such a process, suggesting that it was, in fact, a heritage of the society that perhaps we had left aside and should recover, and then describing the practice of communal discernment and the preconditions necessary for discernment in common. Finally, in October 2017, he launched the discernment process itself by calling for an examine of the existing priorities by Jesuits, colleagues, and partners in mission, and then asking all of those involved to try to seek where the Spirit was already at work in the life of the Society of Jesus, in the apostolic life of the Society and its works. That process took a little over 2 years, and in February 2019, as that process moved up from the various works through to the provinces, through to the conferences, through to the General and his council, then to the Pope, and then back down again, in February 2019, Father General promulgated the Universal Apostolic Preferences that will be for the Society of Jesus for the next 10 years. Well, in 2019, for the next 10 years. So that's the process that led to the preferences. And let's just make sure that we're all on the same page as to what they are, because already in different contexts, people have been rephrasing them, using them differently, which is absolutely necessary. They only make sense when they take flesh in the various contexts in which we work. But what are they in themselves? First, to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment. Second, to walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated, in a mission of reconciliation and justice. 3, to accompany young people in the creation of a hope-filled future. And 4, to collaborate with others in the care of our common home. So those are the 4 apostolic preferences. Now I want to make a couple of observations about those preferences. A preference is not the same thing as a priority. A priority is something that's regarded as more important than other things. A priority is something you adopt at the end of a decision-making process. You reach a decision that this is a priority for us. The UAPs are not priorities. They are not a list of specific apostolates, as we saw in the previous list, specific apostolates in ascending or descending order, nor are they a list of apostolates that are to be promoted at the expense of other apostolates. And as Father General said in his presentation just now, they're not something to accomplish, something to check off on a list. Well, we do this, we do this, we do this, we do this. We're good, we're Ignatian, let's go. A preference is a prior orientation. Again, Father General used that word, orientation. A preference is a prior orientation that guides decision-making and discernment, all other things being equal. So all other things being equal, at Loyola High School in Montreal, we will make decisions from this fourfold place of the UAPs. They will guide our decision-making, all other things being equal, as we try to respond to the needs of our students. They're vital orientations for each Jesuit, for every community, and every apostolate. So just to say the same thing in a different way, the Universal Apostolic Preferences are not spirituality, social justice, youth, and ecology. They're not that. What they are is to show, to walk, to accompany, to collaborate. The verbs are the important part of the preferences. Every Jesuit work, whether it's education, spirituality, social justice, will try to live by those verbs as they do their work. The other important observation is that the Universal Apostolic Preferences are not independent of each other. They are interdependent. So we can think of them according to a series of different images. You can think of them as a fourfold itinerary for our apostolic pilgrimage. So as we're walking along, doing whatever it is that we do in the apostolate, at different moments, one or other of the preferences will be a signpost, or perhaps more than one will be a signpost, and at that moment we will know a certain direction to take. So they're an itinerary, not a map, an itinerary for guiding our steps. It's one way to think about them. Another way to think about them is that they're a horizon within which we journey and which we constantly approach. Again, Father General was very good at talking about them that way. We're constantly growing into them. For those of you who are a little more mathematically inclined, they are a four-dimensional space within which we can advance and grow. So they are 4 dimensions that can help us locate where we are and help us figure out where we want to go. You see, I'm drawing the graph. Or, again, for the mathematically inclined, 4 vectors of growth in the mission. But the phrase that Father General prefers and that I think is most helpful, the image that I think is most helpful, is this last one, that they are 4 interrelated cries of the world to which we are called to be ever more sensitive. There is a cry in the world to move from alienation to a sense of belonging. Belonging in a context, in a world that is rich, that is pregnant with the presence of God. There is a cry from all sorts of marginalized, excluded, impoverished peoples for their dignity to be recognized. There is a cry from youth who are seeking hope. There's a cry from the earth seeking to be heard. 4 interrelated cries that we are called, to which we are called to be ever more sensitive. And so we can think of the preferences as a framework for ongoing apostolic planning and discernment in each of our works. But they are fundamentally, as Father General said in his presentation, a strong call to personal, communal, and institutional conversion. So now let's talk about the first universal apostolic preference. And you'll see I've already changed the language. This is the way we have articulated the first universal apostolic preference in Canada, to offer a way to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment. Why this change? Because our reality in Canada is made up of both English-speaking Canada, which has a particular experience of God, and French-speaking Canada, which has a very different experience of God, particularly in the province of Quebec. In the province of Quebec, because of the history of the Catholic Church there, its collaboration with political power, its way of being really omnipresent in every aspect of life and not in a positive way historically, to say that we're going to show the way to God, it's not going to fly. Similarly, in English Canada, where the religious experience in society is pluralist, to say, again, we're going to show the way to God is going to be difficult. So in both contexts, though the experience is very different, the public religious experience, if you will, or the common religious experience is different, we have found that to say that we offer a way to God is a more positive presentation. I also think that it corresponds very well to some key aspects of the experience of God that Ignatius is trying to invite people into. Now, Pope Francis, in his recognition and approval of the apostolic preferences, says 2 very important things, which are actually in the letter that Father General wrote to the Society, to which you have access in the resources. He said, the first preference is crucial because it presupposes as a basic condition one's relationship with the Lord in a personal and communal life of prayer and discernment. To put it in plain English, you can't give what you don't have. Again, as Father General suggested in his presentation, the first universal apostolic preference invites us into the religious experience presented by Ignatius, invites us into that experience so that we can share it, so that we're not doing this sort of from a place of emptiness, but rather from a place of strength and richness, knowing what we're talking about. And he emphasizes it again, without this prayerful attitude in ourselves, the other preferences will not bear fruit. They'll be lovely, they'll be a great humanistic way to engage the world, nothing wrong with that. They won't be Ignatian, they won't be Jesuit. They won't be the universal apostolic preferences. So let's dig a little deeper into that first universal apostolic preference. And actually, I'm going to only talk about 3 words: way to God. Because actually, if we don't understand that, and there are various ways we could bring, various experiences we could bring to that phrase from our culture, from the context in which we live, that could take us in directions other than the one that Ignatius is proposing. The way to God, for example, is not away from emptiness to fullness, at least not in the Ignatian context. It's not that I don't have an experience of God, God isn't there, and I'm going to look for God over there. As often you will hear even in sermons, in homilies in the church, but as you certainly hear presented in society by various spiritual leaders, gurus, and so on. It's not that there's nothing there and I got to go find it somewhere else. There's a unique experience of God that Ignatius has and shares with us that I think it's important that we recognize, name, and enter into. Again, it's not just information, it's formation. And so what is this unique experience of God that flows from the mystical experience of Ignatius at the Cardinere River? The God that Ignatius knows is a God who labors, a God who acts in the world here and now, who is intimately involved in the world and accomplishes marvelous and holy deeds of both creation and redemption. For Ignatius, creation is not an act of God that took place however long ago. It is that, but it is something that God is doing now, actively, in an engaged way, so that Ignatius could go out into nature and look at a blade of grass, an insect, the smallest thing, and marvel at the laboring activity of God sustaining that creature and filling that creature with God's glory, where God's glory is loving activity. So he had a profound sense of the way in which every element of creation participated in the life and the love of God, but not in this kind of, for those of you who are a little more philosophically inclined, it's not a pantheist or panentheist or any of, no, God is actively at work. Creation, even now, is a great and wonderful deed of God. And the same thing with redemption, with what we would call the world of grace, the way in which creation, which has been broken by sin, is repaired, healed, reconciled, and elevated into the life of the Trinity by Christ and the Spirit, so that it finds a vocation that's greater than it could have achieved by itself. And that includes human history. Ignatian contemplation, the Ignatian encounter with God, begins as admiration and wonder at the great works of God, works of creation, works of grace. This experience of God leads Ignatius to know himself, and it leads us to know ourselves as already caught up in a sacred history that's unfolding around us and that carries us along. So that the real world is not the everyday world of secular sort of science and so on. It's all of that, of course, but it's how that is enriched by an understanding, a grasp of God laboring in the midst of it and in human history, by the gifts of love and grace that we have already received, gifts of life, reconciliation, liberation, and healing. Knowing God who gives God's self to me in this way at every moment of every day, in creation and in the works of grace, gives rise to gratitude in me. Gratitude that seeks to respond to God's generous gift of himself by making of myself a gift to God through my activity. I seek to offer myself in a way that collaborates with what God is already doing. Ignatius uses the language of collaborating with God's will. But really, I discover that will by being attentive to how God is already laboring in my life and in the world around me. That will as expressed in the whole of the divine labors for the redeeming of history and the whole creation. It's an experience of God that leads me to seek a personal engagement in that sacred history of both cosmos and culture, to restore right relationship with God, with others, and with creation itself. Thus, the way to God, as Ignatius understands it, is not a journey where God is the final destination somewhere out there. It's not something, God is not someone or something I'm trying to reach sometime in the future ahead of me. Rather, the way to God is a joining with Him here and now, joining with the risen Jesus and the Holy Spirit as a laborer with God in the world now. You could think of it as a way of pilgrimage with Christ. Pilgrimage with Christ under the guidance of the Spirit, where I walk with Jesus as Jesus continues his mission today in his body and in the world, in his body, the church, and in the world. And by joining with Christ along the path in this pilgrimage way, I grow in communion with Jesus and so grow into the life of the Trinity, which has been giving itself to me and to us. The details of the destination are not something I possess or have a hold of. It's a pilgrimage. I don't have a map. Rather, the Spirit and Christ provide an itinerary with signposts on the ground as I go along in my experience. Hence, the way in which we are to understand the Universal Apostolic Preferences. So the way to God lies in collaborating with Christ and the Spirit in the world. Really, Ignatius's encounter with God is a particular way of understanding and living Christ's double commandment of love. For Ignatius, love of God takes flesh, becomes incarnate as love of neighbor. And so it's not love of God and love of neighbor, as we often perhaps receive that teaching of Christ, but rather it's love of God made real, made flesh, made concrete as love of neighbor. Or to use Ignatius's phrase, greater praise, reverence, and service of God through greater service of the neighbor, or as greater service of the neighbor. The greater praise and service of God is the same as the greater service of creatures. This is the interconnection between the first universal apostolic preference and the other three. The other three universal apostolic preferences give flesh and depth and concreteness to the way to God. And the way to God gives depth and meaning and creativity and fullness to the other three universal apostolic preferences. The way to God is lived by walking with the poor, accompanying young people, and collaborating in the care of our common home. Hence, the significance of discernment and the spiritual exercises as the two key ways of living this way to God according to the first universal apostolic preferences. Let's begin by remembering something that I'm sure many of you already know, but it's worth reviewing, that the spiritual exercises, as Ignatius understands them, are a way of promoting and deepening interior freedom that allows one to respond humbly and generously with Christ to the Father's will in the Spirit. Again, as we've already seen, for the exercises, in the exercises, true history is what God does, not what we do. And so listening in the exercises is a question, listening to God's will in the exercises is a question of deepening interior freedom, letting go of our desire to control events, letting go of the desire to have primary control over even our own lives, letting go of the ego that gets in the way of offering ourselves generously to God's project for the greater good of the whole universe. It's not that we don't have a role to play, or that we don't have a voice, or that we don't have a responsibility. But so much of, particularly today, so much of our understanding of what it is to be free relies on a notion of self-control and ego-centeredness, that it becomes very, very difficult to hear God's call to us, to notice how God is laboring in our lives, because we already have an idea of how we want our lives to be, how we want God to respond to that, and how we want God to work with us in the establishment of the goals that we have defined. Much of the exercises is spent undoing that, getting us to a place where we can exercise our human responsibility with openness to listen, so that we can offer ourselves to God's project for the greater good of the whole universe, and in this way discover our own greater good and fulfillment. So that our own greater good and fulfillment is a gift that we receive, having made an offering of ourselves to participate in how God is bringing about the good of the universe, the good of the cosmos. This is why the practice of the examen is so foundational to the exercise of discernment. We often think of the examen apart from the spiritual exercises, but it's very, very important to remember what the examen is about in the context of the exercises. Now, I know for those of you who are familiar with the spiritual exercises, who may have made the exercises, we encounter the examen at the beginning. But the examen doesn't come into its full meaning until the very end of the spiritual exercises, when we have made what's called, in various ways, the contemplatio ad amorem in Latin. I like to translate it as the contemplation that leads me to dwell into the love of God. Much too long, but that Latin ad is really problematic. The contemplation into the love of God, the contemplation to attain the love of God, the contemplation to reach for the love of God, the contemplation to find oneself in the love of God. Ad is a problem, but it's all of those things. God takes the initiative in the events of our lives and in the events around us. God acts first. And God is constantly sharing God's self with us out of love. That's the starting point of that exercise, the contemplatio, the contemplation to attain the love of God. Gratitude and love arise in our hearts in the face of these gifts that are showered upon us. And we want to make a gift of ourselves to God in return. That's the stance of the examen in its fullness. For those of you who are familiar with the simple structure of the examen, you begin with an opening prayer, offering yourself to God. But then what do? You take time to be grateful for gifts received. That's not a perfunctory exercise. That's an invitation into the contemplatio, to really taste and savor the richness, the fullness of God's gift to you in the last 24 hours. And having done that, to allow gratitude to rise in your heart so that you are properly disposed then to listen to how God has been laboring in your day. Consolation and desolation in that context of love aren't just feelings that I have. I felt good about this, I felt bad about this. Or they're not just psychological emanations that say, oh, God must have been there, that feels really peaceful. Or God must have been not there because I'm still conflicted. Consolation and desolation in that context are experiences of being drawn into the love of God in whatever event. Whatever the feeling is, what is the vector of that feeling? Is that feeling drawing me into greater communion with Christ, into a greater freedom, a greater sense of peace, a greater generosity, a greater zeal to collaborate? Or is that same feeling, no matter how positive, we'll assume it's a positive feeling, leading me to withdraw into my own ego, away from that generous gift of self, wanting my own way, less peace, greater confusion about how do I listen to God's will? What's important is not the feeling that I notice in relation to an event, but the movement, I use the word vector, but the movement that that feeling expresses. That's the important reality. And that's going to be important when we start talking about communal discernment. It's hard enough to do in our own lives. You know, it's hard enough to, with consistent practice of the examen, to notice the vectors, the movements that are being communicated to us in our experiences through these feeling responses. But then how do we do that in discernment in common? When what I'm trying to notice is the movement of the Spirit in the life of our group as a corporate body. What is happening to our group in this conversation as we try to discern the call of the Spirit? But precisely the other three Universal Apostolic Preferences provide orientation and guidance by pointing to places where we have already met the Spirit at work for the greater common good of all creatures, places where Christ calls to us to follow and join him in his mission. Places that are themselves interconnected with each other. And I've already pointed this out, that young people, for example, have a great zeal for the care of our common home. The state of our common home is intimately linked with the future of the poor and the excluded and the marginalized, the outcast and those who suffer abuse, and so on. Responding to these calls requires communal action, and it requires discerning realities greater than myself, which requires communal discernment to learn not only how God is at work in my life, but how the Spirit is at work among us, calling us to a common apostolic action. And so the consequences of that first apostolic preference, hello, there we go. As Father Sosa presents the consequences of this first preference, it leads us to strive to experience secular society as something we can read, where we read the signs of the times, according to the other three preferences, that affords us the opportunity to renew our presence at the heart of history, to live greater service of neighbor at the heart of the world as it is today. And it calls us to live the spiritual exercises ourselves more deeply so that they bring us to a deeper personal and communal relationship to Christ and thus to transformation and conversion. So that then we can offer the spiritual exercises with more creativity, make regular use of spiritual conversation and discernment, and share the spiritual exercises and practices of discernment with others so that they can enter into this unique experience of God, which I believe is especially relevant to the way in which certainly Western society is today. Becomes an opportunity to teach, to share what we've been given, to foster the growth of groups that discern and act in collaboration with God. And I'm just going to slip in little sales pitch for the IPP here. The Ignatian pedagogical paradigm is a unique transposition of this kind of disposition, this kind of approach to reality. And we can make hay with the IPP in promoting this kind of transformation in our students, introducing them into this kind of world, and not just in religion classes. You know, so you don't have to teach people the examen. It's wonderful if you do. But simply making use of the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm in all of its richness and all of its depth can introduce people into this kind of world that Ignatius is trying to present. So, what does that mean for us this week as we wrap up this talk? This week includes a kind of retreat in everyday life. It's not a silent retreat, but a retreat in everyday life. Every morning after morning prayer, there'll be a presentation on one of the other 3 UAPs. After this presentation, there'll be a break, and I'll say something about that in a minute. And after the break, I will propose to you some points for prayer and reflection on the presentation, after which you'll have a short period for reflection. Then you'll gather at your tables where you are, in small groups for spiritual conversation on the fruits of your prayer and reflection, and begin that process of experiencing communal discernment as a reading of the signs of the times. So we're not going to reach decisions this week. We're not after that kind of experience of discernment, but we want to get a sense of how together we can read the signs of the times out of our own common experience at each table. Just a little comment. Because of the way in which the logistics of the morning work, there's going to be a half-hour break between the end of the talk and the time of reflection, where you'll be invited to go get a coffee, have a chat, and so on and so forth. That's marvelous. There's a danger in it, because you'll no longer be in the experience. So, I have a suggestion. We're all educators. We love taking notes, I've been noticing. All the presentations, all of the material will be available after the talks. You don't need to do a verbatim of the presentations. So I would invite you to consider the possibility of taking notes only on what moves you as you listen. So as you listen to the talk, what catches your attention? What causes you to have a sense of hope? What excites you? What moves you in one way or another? Note that. And if you're taking other kinds of notes, put that in a different section, so that when you come back after the half-hour break, you'll have something that will lead you back into the experience of the talk, so that you can somehow re-enter into that and respond to the points for reflection. And then after that, you'll gather in small groups for spiritual conversation and begin that process of listening to the movements of the Spirit. 2 things, basic ground rules for spiritual conversation. You have the instructions for spiritual conversation on the app. Some of you I know have listened to the videos. If you haven't done that yet, go listen to them tonight. But some basic ground rules. One is active listening. The goal of active listening is to seek to understand others as they are and not as I want them to be. It means listening not only to what the other person is saying, but also to what they mean to say, what they mean as they speak, and to what they might be experiencing interiorly. For those of you who are familiar with the annotations at the beginning of the exercises, this is annotation 22. To really be welcoming of what you hear and give it the best possible interpretation. It means welcoming non-judgmentally whatever the person says, no matter what you think about what is being said or what you think about the person. It means allowing myself to be affected by the other, to be moved by the other, and it means being attentive to how I am moved by what I hear. So I not only listen to the other person, but I listen to myself listening to the other person, as an expression was shared with me earlier this evening. And corresponding to active listening is intentional speaking. We don't share in real time. There was a Jesuit I knew when I was in formation. We met every summer as young Jesuits in formation, and we had a time of checking in with each other. How was your year? And most of us took 5-10 minutes. He shared in real time. This is not intentional speaking. We don't want to take 365 days to talk about 365 days. Intentional speaking refers to a sincere expression of oneself, of one's experience, feelings, and thoughts, yes, and it's based on a habit of attention to oneself, to be aware of how one is responding interiorly to the other. This inner self-awareness then guides how I engage in the conversation, seeking always to remain free of selfish motivations in what I say. It means speaking from one's own experience and from what one is indeed thinking and feeling, and saying it simply, directly, and without embellishment. It's a free, generous gift of myself to others in reciprocity for being actively listened to. Now, the process itself is very simple. There's 3 rounds. The first round is on the fruits of your prayer and reflection that you'll have done. No crosstalk. You share what you experienced, not your response to what you heard somebody else say in the first round. There's a prayerful pause. The second round, how are you moved by what you heard in the first round? That means you don't give advice or answers to what somebody said. No problem solving. No first round sharing of something that you forgot to say. But how were you moved as you listened? Another prayerful pause, and then in the third round, what am I grateful for in this time of conversation? What remains with me? That third round is where stuff begins to surface about how our group is being moved. You have the guide on UAP. I encourage you to check it again. So, for this evening, this is not for spiritual conversation. This is homework before you go to bed. This is your examen tonight. If you've never done an examen, do one now. An examen of your experience, on your experience of the first Universal Apostolic Preference. What remains with you from the presentation? What affected you in a particular way? What particularly moved you about Ignatius's experience of God, about the Ignatian experience of God? Have you had similar experiences, encounters with God who labors? And in light of all of that, you don't have to do all 3 questions. There's just 3 different ways of getting at the same thing. But in light of any one of those 3 questions, what desires arise in you for your collaboration with God who labors in the apostolate of Jesuit education? Thank you very much for your attention, and happy homework.
Having had the pleasure of introducing Gilles, I now have the pleasure of thanking him. And I do want to thank him for setting us up so clearly and so intelligently and inspiringly to help us get the best out of this different way of doing colloquium, this entry into the spiritual dynamics of our life and work in Jesuit education. So Gilles, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights and your encouragement for us to go deeper into the spirituality of Ignatius as part of our life in education. Thank you.